All right, good afternoon, everybody. Here from my new quarantine bunker.
We are seeing a significant increase in cases, and we are well within the red alert.
The vaccine will be available to the entire general population, with the exception of places like New York State.
This is not Trump versus Biden. This is Republic of the United States versus a socialist takeover.
More people may die if we don't coordinate.
This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. You heard Governor Ned Lamont when he was beginning quarantine after his communications director tested positive for COVID-19. Also in the mix, New Haven Health Director Maritza Bond, President Donald Trump, a Trump supporter in Massachusetts, courtesy of the New England News Collaborative, and President-elect Joe Biden. On the panel today, I want to welcome back to the show Bill Curry, a political analyst, former Democratic nominee for governor, and an advisor in the Clinton White House. Bill, how you doing?
Great to be with you, Lucy, as always.
Harriet Jones is here, Connecticut Public Radio managing editor. Hi, Harriet.
Hi, Lucy.
And Colin McEnroe's here, host of the Colin McEnroe Show and a columnist at Hearst, Connecticut. Hi, Colin.
Good morning, Lucy, Bill, and Harriet.
And you can join us, too, on Twitter. Find us at WNPR Wheelhouse. Now, the number of people hospitalized with COVID-19 in Connecticut has increased daily. Now, almost 800 patients are hospitalized across the state. More than 5% of coronavirus tests came back positive again yesterday. 5% is considered a threshold for positivity rate being too high. And the number of deaths in Connecticut has accelerated in recent weeks. 4,771 people have died from COVID in Connecticut during this pandemic. We're starting off with the bad news, Colin. When you look at where our state is, where our country is, I mean, how are you feeling these days?
Well, actually, let me start out with just a little bit of good news, just so I'm not the Cassandra that I almost always am here. So, we do have good news. We have 2 vaccines with a very high efficacy rate. I mean, we didn't know anything like that was going to happen. We have the first EUA of a rapid home virus test. It's maybe not the best home test that we're going to get, but we're talking something a little bit more like a home pregnancy test. We've got new evidence as of today of durable immune response of greater than 8 months and maybe more. This is really, really good news. This is the immune response of people who recover from the disease. And we've got the first EUA of a monoclonal antibody therapy. That's from Lilly. So those are 4 big things, and they happen in a handful of days. I mean, that science doesn't usually move that fast, and these are all on the front of one disease. So that's good. Okay, let's go back to the bad news. The bad news is, we cannot survive the trend lines that we have right now here in Connecticut. I mean, we just can't. They have to be bent down. We're not in the sort of lethal area yet. I mean, obviously some people are dying, but for example, the thing that I probably watch the most is the hospitalization rate, just because if you look to the Midwest right now where they have horrendous problems, you see what that looks like when systems get overwhelmed. Now, we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near what we were at the peak of hospitalizations. But we can't survive the trend line that we have right now. We're seeing, 100% increases in hospitalization over about a 3-week period. Can't do it. So, that's why we should be genuinely concerned. The case rate isn't a high number compared to, say, South Dakota or North Dakota or Wyoming, but it's a high number compared to where we were before. And so you look at the trend lines, they're moving in the wrong direction. We need a significant course correction in Connecticut if we're not going to have horrible problems. And obviously we are heading into this incredibly dangerous period. I'm assuming everybody who listens to this station now understands that Thanksgiving is a cause for worry in addition to being a cause for thanks.
Bill Curry, how are you feeling?
Personally, very well, thank you. I agree with what Colin said about the good news about the vaccine. There are obviously all these, we're all becoming amateur epidemiologists in the last year, and one of the things we've learned is that they're usually right, the actual professional epidemiologists. And what they're saying is pretty is pretty dark about the next few months. You know, it's another way in which we should all know our history a little better. In the Great Spanish Flu, it was the second wave that began about November that brought on all the carnage for which we remember the event, and the possibility that we stand there despite all the advances in medicine and technology and all the increased prosperity. I don't think I don't for a moment anticipate casualties of that magnitude, but the idea that another 250,000 people could die in the next few months is quite plausible. So we have lots of things. Before the show, I was trying to hook myself up belatedly to the Connecticut COVID alert app for your cell phones. If I could do one positive thing here before passing the baton on, it would be to encourage people, especially people who are more tech savvy than I am, for whom it would take fewer minutes than it's taking me, to just download the app, and you get an automatic notification if you've been in touch with someone. It's the least invasive in terms of privacy of any of the kinds of tracing apps you may have read about. We have it online. It's here in Connecticut, and if we all do it, fewer people will die.
I'm glad you brought up that app, Bill. Harriet, it was just unveiled this week, and I think a lot of people have been downloading it in Connecticut, more so than you'd see in other states.
Absolutely, yes. I think it was brought online last Thursday, and by Monday, it had been downloaded 600,000 times in the state. So clearly, people are looking for tools. They want to be able to keep themselves safe, and they see this as a plausible way to do it. So it works via Bluetooth. If your phone has been close to the phone of somebody else who then tests positive, they enter their test result into the app, then you get a notification automatically. You don't know who it was. There's no privacy issue, but you do know that you should then be taking steps to test yourself to quarantine. So it's a way of breaking the chain of transmission.
We had Governor Lamont on Where We Live earlier this week. I think he brought up the fact, or either that or in the briefing that he did, that having that COVID app actually worked for his inner circle, with mentioning at the top of the show, Max Reese, his communications director, testing positive for COVID. And now you have the governor and his senior staff, among others, quarantining. Colin, this just shows from the standpoint of a governor and his team being very cautious, wearing masks, being careful about social distancing. This disease, this virus, it's something that people need to really take seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're now, for example, the Wall Street Journal today has a piece that I think the headline is something like, "We did everything right. People report getting COVID despite taking precautions." Although when you read the piece, you discover that, no, they didn't do everything right. It's hard to be perfect. Almost nobody is perfect. And so there's that time when you're talking to somebody and maybe in a professional capacity, or somebody who's come to work on your house. And a lot of people have the habit of pulling the mask down when they're talking because they think their voices will be muffled. That, of course, is when you should have your mask up, is when you are talking. People make mistakes. And I think one of the great things about the app, too, is, and I just would just chime in and double down on what Bill and Harriet have said, everybody should get it on their phones. It works better with a critical mass. Is that, first of all, contact tracing right now relies heavily on people's memories. And I can't even remember how many limbs I have most of the time, never mind where I've been or who I've stood next to. And a lot of times you don't know who you were standing next to at the dog park or, in the grocery store parking lot or something like that. So, that's a really, really valuable tool. And maybe also it's an indication or an example of things that you can do that are not full lockdowns that can help you a lot. I mean, clearly Governor Lamont, he said it on your show, he wants to avoid a lockdown. I think the word lockdown in particular is something he wants to avoid. But as we look across the ocean at Europe, they're ahead of us. They were ahead of us with a resurgence. Almost all of these countries now have managed to turn their curves down. They've used, in some cases, measures that we wouldn't use. For example, in Greece, It's a much more closely controlled phone thing where there's like 6 reasons you can leave the house, and you have to punch one of those reasons into your phone before you leave the house, and you can be stopped by the police and they can check, and is this really a number 5 that you're doing right now? Slovakia is testing everybody. Now, Slovakia has like 5 million people, so I mean, but as testing everybody over a short window. Those are probably things we can't do. But as we look around, we can see things that appear to work. We should be looking at Europe very hard. Of course, one of the things that Europe has almost invariably is national leadership. Macron and Merkel and people like that, they set the policies for their country. We don't have that. But we can look at sort of micro tools that can help us.
I'm glad you brought up Europe. Governor did talk about that. Let's hear that clip, Kat. It's A4.
Schools, particularly K through 8, can operate safely. We're seeing that in Europe, which has a very high infection rate, but a very low infection rate in their schools, which they've kept open. I think we're finding that retail establishments, even places of business, you're more likely to follow the protocols there, and I think we'll be able to keep those going as well. But those places where there's a lot of informal social interaction, that's what we're most worried about in terms of the spread.
But Bill Curry, did you want to add something to this idea or what the governor has said where he doesn't want to return to where our state was in March?
Yeah, I would just say that, and I think the governor's done well in responding to this crisis. You look across the world, and everybody who took the quarantine light approach, and even the mask light approach from Sweden to Iowa and the Dakotas, is in a state of profound crisis right now. And everybody who took the Angela Merkel approach is doing better. And we read that the numbers in Europe have also been resurgent, and that's true. But the United States, which had always led the world in the rate of infection, we have 5 times the global average infection rate. Nobody else is even close to that. We're the world's still technically the world's most prosperous country, and we're last. It is absolutely an indication of the degree to which we are a failed state in this country, a dysfunctional state, paralyzed in the face of crisis as a country, not the state of Connecticut. But it also suggests to me very strongly that even the people who are on the right side of this, the Cuomos and the Lamonts and all of our congressional leadership, we can't be so intimidated by the infantilization of the American people that we've witnessed over the last few decades, that we stop talking to them as adults. And we can't be afraid to get up and say, listen, this isn't a choice between a lockdown and a free society. This is a choice between isolating and putting on masks for a few months so that people live. The only way back to a free society is by taking responsibility, which, by the way, is always the very essence of citizenship. And the idea that in a crisis of this magnitude, we can't give that direction from the top and we can't follow it from the rest of us, it now distinguishes us in the world. There is no question, when you look at all the countries and their performance, there is no question that the rate of COVID infection is a direct corollary of the health of the government. It is whether the government is working that determines whether we defeat this and at what cost. And so I just think looking at Connecticut, we'll move on to this, but I just think looking at Connecticut as across the country, my one wish is that our leaders all take a stronger stand on this. This has to be rooted out now. We have to face it now and speak frankly now about what our choices are. The choice isn't between lockdown and recovery. Recovery is health. The recovery of our health is the key to economic recovery.
That's a good point, Bill. Harriet, what do you think about that Bill shared, including this idea of people, sacrificing just for a few more months for the benefit for all of us?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We can look at the differences maybe between where we are now and where we were back in February, March, when the first wave, came upon us. We're more prepared in the terms of we have sources of PPE. I think we're better supplied with things like PPE, things like hand sanitizer. Remember back in March when you just couldn't find hand sanitizer anywhere in the pharmacy? Those sorts of supply chain issues, I think, have been sorted out. testing. We're much, much better prepared with testing. It's much easier to get testing. But one thing that really confuses me about Governor Lamont's approach is if you ask him about the first wave, he will say, I wish my one wish is I had done everything I did a week earlier. And now we're in this situation where we see this rising hospitalization rate. We're still at kind of half the peak of where we were before, but it's going up significantly. And that's the key metric, really, for whether the state can stay on top of this, is the hospitalization rate. And Lamont is really, he's soft pedaling this more so than are some of his municipal leaders. We saw Justin Alliker just this week, the mayor of New Haven, saying, you know what, I think it's time. It's time to go back to phase one. It's time to shut down indoor dining in restaurants. And the governor is really very focused on keeping schools open, to the dismay of some teachers, and also, continuing to allow things like indoor dining. And it's interesting to see that change in approach from our leadership.
Colin, what do you think about that?
I want to just build up. First of all, I think Harriet just expressed this really, really well, particularly that idea of Lamont wishing he'd done everything that he did in March 1 week earlier. And now you sort of see, this is going to be worse. This nationally and maybe in Connecticut, this is going to be worse than March and April. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And so the idea that he's kind of gently tapping the brakes and twisting the dials a little bit as opposed to really kind of landing hard on some choices is a little nervous making. And I just also want to go back to the clip that you played because, there's a muddy quality to the reasoning there, and it doesn't really map that well onto what has happened in Europe. He says, well, in Europe they kept the schools open, and a consistent trend in Europe was, yes, we're going to keep the schools open even if we have to do other things. We may have to sacrifice other things. We're going to choose priorities. Our big priority in most of these countries, they said schools are a big priority. We're going to put them first. And in other sectors of life may have to be a lot more restrictive in order to achieve that goal. And I think, Ned and an awful lot of other state leaders, they do it more like somebody who's mixing a Blue Oyster Cult song, a little bit of cowbell up and push the drums up a little bit on the board and pull the piano down, the vocals. And Emily Brindley and Alex Putterman from The Current have a story either yesterday or today just comparing what Lamont has done to what's going on in other states. And it's dizzying because there's no consistent thread. One governor's tougher on gyms than another governor, but then the other governor's tougher on restaurants. And there's no clear path here, and there's no pattern. And it's one of the real liabilities of having 50 different pandemic policies. They can't all be right. Yeah, go ahead, Harriet.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you. I do wonder whether some of that reluctance has to do with the lack of federal leadership, because we did, at least in the first wave, we did see Congress saying, okay, we have to do stimulus here. We have to produce a big package of money through PPP for businesses and through extended unemployment benefits for people like you and I. And that is not going to happen in the lame duck session. I don't see the willingness in Congress to actually get together and do significant stimulus before the Biden administration comes in. So maybe that's in the calculus of governors, that they don't see anyone riding to their rescue if they do have to shut down.
Good point. One of the things, the idea, I'm shocked to see in Connecticut the same interplay between a governor and the mayors that I've seen in Iowa, in Florida, in Georgia. I'm for everyone having the maximum possible latitude to deal with the situation they have on their hands, and at every level of government, not to fall short of the state standards, but to exceed them where it's where local leaders deem it appropriate. But that's in the current context. The larger context is just exactly what Harriet said, which is why we don't have a uniform federal policy. And of course, the answer right now is Trump. But as soon as Trump's gone, the answer will also be some confusion. And I hear this from Biden talking about calling up the governors and asking them if they wouldn't all like to do mandates and quarantines. And I can just guess how that will go. The idea that there is any kind of debate in this country, never mind a raging debate about how much authority the President of the United States has in a pandemic to issue an emergency order for public health, is stunning to me. And again, it's just, we've tripped into it. when Trump shut down the airports in a spotty way in China and Europe, which was a massive imposition on commerce and freedom to travel, nobody said boo about whether he had the authority to do that. And now we have these questions of masks and regulating these activities. There's an Emergency Powers Act. There was an Emergency Powers Public Health Act. I've actually seen people say, since all these kinds of regulations by the federal government are, due to the peculiarities of our Constitution, premised on its authority to regulate interstate commerce. I mean, people are actually arguing that, that the virus isn't an interstate commerce because it's free or something. I don't know what the idea is, but can we possibly be the only developed country in the world whose chief executive can't declare an emergency of public health in the midst of the worst global pandemic in 100 years? Is this even conceivable? And the one thing I can tell you is that thinking about this in recent weeks, I looked it up to find if I could find a shred of legal authority on behalf of the side that says we can only jawbone, we can't act, and I can't find it in both the broad emergency powers of the president and the specific powers of the Public Health Emergency Act, adopted in the 1940s and updated since. There's all the authority in the world, as of course there has to be. And so again, it's just time for us. I know, we're a people who've lost touch with the meaning of democracy and freedom. And if you've got a society that thinks freedom means there ought to be 100 kinds of ice cream and 12 kinds of ice cream and 100 kinds of breakfast cereal in the store for you, if that's all that freedom has come down to, your ability to do whatever you want when you want to, regardless of the consequences of others, we're in such deep trouble. And so we have to stand up to that as well as to the virus.
Colin, I want to go back to you because you started off the show talking about the good news, the fact that there's these 2 vaccines that are showing over 95% efficacy. I'm thinking to the job ahead for President-elect Joe Biden and his administration to come up with a distribution plan for these vaccines, not to mention dealing with people in communities across our country who may not take this vaccine for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, look, 2021 is going to be the year of the mask. Sensible, responsible people are going to be wearing masks pretty much all the way through 2021. Because first of all, we rolling out these vaccines. I mean, these vaccines are in production. I mean, Pfizer's been making they basically have been held harmless financially by the federal government. So I mean, they're making doses of them already. The Moderna vaccine is a little bit more shelf stable than the Pfizer vaccine. It's probably going to be a little bit easier to handle and get into sort of smaller patient group settings. The Pfizer vaccine is probably going to be more like, I don't know, you go into a town and set up somewhere and you vaccinate all the seniors all at once or something. But it's going to take a while. And trust, as you indicated, is not high in a lot of areas. And there's a lot of things we don't know about the vaccine. For example, we don't know whether these will provide protective or sterilizing immunity. Protective means I don't get a full expression of the disease if I'm vaccinated, but sterilizing immunity means I can't give the disease to somebody else when I'm vaccinated. And those are 2 very different things. I don't think there's any data from Pfizer or Moderna about that. And of course, the safety data isn't there because there just hasn't been enough time to look at what happens to people 6 months after they get vaccinated. So we've got a long haul ahead of us. And the reality is we're going to have to practice social distancing. We are going to have to wear masks. We are going to have to be consistent about hand washing and stuff like that pretty much through 2021. And it's the death rate is going to drop because the therapies are going to get better. The hospitalizations will drop. Presumably the percentage of positive tests will drop. But it won't go away. It won't go away right away. And we're going to have to be careful. I mean, you could get vaccinated and be a super spreader if it turns out you have only protective and not sterilizing immunity. You could go around giving other people a disease that you will never get. So there's so many things that we don't know. 2021 will be a year of caution.
That's Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show here on Connecticut Public Radio. You're listening to The Wheelhouse. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Also with us this week, Bill Curry, political analyst, former Democratic nominee for governor and advisor in the Clinton White House, and Harriet Jones, Connecticut Public Radio managing editor. Coming up after the break, the votes show Joe Biden will be the next president, but the current occupant of the White House is not accepting that. What's going to happen with this transition? We'll talk about that after the break. This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. On the panel today, Bill Curry, political analyst, former Democratic nominee for governor and advisor in the Clinton White House. Harriet Jones is here, Connecticut Public Radio managing editor, and Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show. Now, the presidential race has been decided. Joe Biden won the Electoral College and the popular vote. States have already started certifying their results. Today's the deadline for the completion of a recount in Georgia. Results there are expected to be released tomorrow, although they are not expected to alter the state's support for Joe Biden. In Wisconsin, the Trump campaign must decide by the end of the day today if it wants to pay as much as $7.9 million for this recount. Bill, I know you have some thoughts on what the last few days mean for our democracy and what's going to happen with the transition.
You know, a favorite play of mine that I read early on in life, By the Skin of Our Teeth by Thornton Wilder, is the story of Henry Antrobus, who makes it through the Ice Age and floods and all these terrible catastrophes just barely in one act after another. And I'm feeling a little like Henry Antrobus, like we're all that guy, you know, and his family who just made it through by the skin of our teeth. Through what? Through what I truly regard is the closest thing to a fascist coup that our present culture and institutional arrangements could possibly experience. And one of the great failures of all of us has been to label Trumpism for what it is, which is fascism. It checks every box in every scholarly article ever written. And it is deceptive to talk about it as populism, certainly conservatism, republicanism, any of that. This is fascism, and all the protocols and delicacies of our best media traditions, inhibit us from calling it what it is. In all the books that were written, on tyranny, all wonderful books about fascism and authoritarianism written at the beginning of the Trump era, none of them said what they told us we should do, which is name it, right in real time. This is fascism right now. You know, P.S. What I just wrote this book about is what's happening to you as I write. And I'm hoping that when Trump is gone, we'll be able to begin to label the movement that's left here in America, as we don't hesitate to label it across the world. It is part of a global fascist uprising, an attack on democracy by people who have contempt for democracy. And I think we owe it to the people who are supporting it to at least tell them which team they're suiting up for, and begin to help people understand how great a threat it is. And about the transition so far, again, the worst moments to me in Pennsylvania, it's not just the recount, it's that he clearly has spent 6 months trying to get Pennsylvania legislators to overturn the popular vote in that state in secret. There's no question that Lindsey Graham is calling secretaries of state, trying to get them to throw out valid ballots. And he may be slightly cryptic in the way he words it, but there's no mistaking his meaning. And I'll just add one other thing to it. Once again, unlike in the COVID experience, where a much stronger and coordinated and uniform federal effort would be our salvation. Our salvation here is in part been two things. One, it's been the very decentralization of the system. It turns out to be hard to corrupt 50 states worth of election officials. And the second thing has been public servants themselves. And I'm just reminded of, watching, former Ukraine Ambassador Ukraine Maria Yovanovitch and Colonel Vindman and so many of these public servants when they came forward a year ago and lost their careers by coming forward to tell the truth. Watching the election officials from both parties in state after state stand up for the integrity of their own work and of the system they pledge to defend has been the most heartening thing about all of this. There have been so many depressing and unnerving things we've had to watch. But for all the people who spend their time reviling state employees or other public employees, once again, those people have risen up and shown the kind of leadership that too many of our political leaders seem incapable of providing. And we owe them an enormous a debt of thanks. If, as in the Michigan board, and it went from a 2-2 tie to a 4-0 vote after enormous pressure, and just one or two other places, this would have failed. And Trump would have been the third example after his own election in 2016 and Bush in 2000, in which a person with a minority of the vote and an illegitimate minority of the vote nonetheless became president of the United States. So we should all take this warning to heart. There is a movement, and it's something that deserves to be called something other than Trumpism, and it's not going away. And we have to begin to put the health of our democracy, public corruption, voter suppression, all these issues, we have to put them at the center of the debate where they belong so that we can defend them.
Harriet, let's unpack what Bill just shared with us. Let's start with what he said about the media calling it for what it is, and to talk about fascism when we think about President Trump and his actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an important point, but one of the things that makes me uneasy about that is how little consensus there is now in our population about labels and about what is true and what is a fact. I think that you probably could label things fascism all you wanted, but the people who support those ideas simply will go to another source, simply will deny facts. We don't have any kind of common coming together around ideas anymore, and that's a lot to do with the splintering of media, the influence of social media, rampant disinformation that's spreading on social media. And people can simply choose their reality. So I think even if we label things in an aggressive way, in a way that many of us would see as true, I don't know that we would have enough people recognize or come together around those ideas anymore.
I think another example of that is when we've seen Republicans over the last year labeling Joe Biden a socialist, and that label definitely made a impact on his base, Bill.
In a mere few months, the right wing convinced the country that Joe Biden, of all people, is a socialist. He's not. I think that we should believe enough in the truth. Harriet made a lot of fine points. But the word isn't aggressive here, I think. I think the word is simply clear. And, here's Trump able, because we don't fight these kinds of fights, Trump is able to accuse Hunter Biden of vast corruption without ever saying a single thing he did that was corrupt. He never made a criminal charge of any kind. Whole year we spent on it. They never even said what he did that was supposed to be illegal, let alone how it affected Joe Biden. The same with once again now with the election. They spent a year crying fraud without they spent a month crying fraud, a year really before the election, and never showing a single example of it. They convinced enough voters to stop the blue wave that the Democrats were a party of extremists while they were in bed with the Proud Boys and, for that matter, the Ku Klux Klan and David Duke and so forth. And so, there's just one party has dipped into extremism. A whole body of scholarly work has been developed in order to describe it, how it functions, what it is. It's one of the in psychology and psychotherapy, people tell you that you start change by bringing something from unconsciousness to consciousness, and then the next step is naming it. And those two steps take away a lot of the power from the demons that may bedevil you. Well, I think it's true in politics too. We start by bringing this to conscious awareness. We need to, and then we name it so that we can have a precise, not an aggressive in my mind, but a precise discussion of what's gone wrong. We can't. We've seen this in fascist histories, by the way. People not understanding how close they came to going down before they finally went down, and especially of liberal centrist establishments being unwilling, unable not having the tools or the brass to call what they saw what it was. And so, we can't be judgmental. We don't want to get into name calling fights, but a whole public education program centered around this, run by major media outlets, I think it would help. And it's better than calling it something it's not.
But I question whether, how do you deliver that public education program if there is no, consensus around which, people can simply opt out and go to their Facebook group that tells them that centers around their own particular conspiracy theory. I'm not sure how you any more in this media environment, how you deliver the truth.
It's a really big point. I'll just say lastly, some people in the media have started to do it. Michelle Goldberg at the time used the word fascist. Stephen Colbert now uses the word fascist seriously. There are a half dozen people in mainstream who just in the last couple of months have started to do it. In 2016, the New York Times didn't use the word lie or liar applied to Donald Trump until after the election. It doesn't appear in the Post or the Times even once. Misstatements, falsehoods. We are sort of pussyfooting around in these things hasn't helped us. And having, believing in the power of the truth itself and standing by it and expecting it to do its work is something that in a democracy you kind of have to do. And lastly, I do understand that some of the people we've lost to Trumpism / fascism aren't coming back. They're not coming back to civil society. They may not come back to electoral politics. I hope that happens. We want to take as many of them back as we can. We want to reach out to them. This has been a great mistake of the Democratic Party in the last few years, not making an earnest, respectful case to millions and millions of people whom we lost, who weren't fascist and weren't racist, or they wouldn't have voted twice for Obama, and they would have voted for somebody like Trump 30 years ago. And we have to find ways to bring them back into the public debate, knowing we're not going to get them all. And the new consensus of this country could be as large as 60%, which is about as large as a consensus ever gets. And some of the people we don't bring into it, we're going to lose forever. It breaks my heart, but it's true. But we have to put together the consensus that is available to us.
Colin, I want you to get in on this.
Yeah, obviously we've got two problems that are hard to solve at the same time, and Bill has just kind of stated them. On the one hand, yes, you do want to name a thing for what it is. On the other hand, you don't want to drive away. Look, Biden's going to win this election by 5.5 million votes, maybe more than that. But we're still talking about 70 million Trump voters, and most of them don't cotton to being told that they voted for a fascist. It's not going to go over well with a lot of them, and I think we are going to have to find a new way to communicate. Biden might be kind of the right guy for this. I was never enthusiastic about his candidacy this time, never thought he should be the nominee, but he actually might be the right man for the moment. Meanwhile, I think we have to find ways to honor a group of people Bill was talking about at the beginning of this segment, and that is like those Profile and Courage Awards that the Kennedy Library gives out. That guy Raffensperger in Georgia should get one, or all election officials in America, which they've done. I think they did all public employees who were 9/11 responders after 2001. There should be a lot of things like that, where the people who cared more about truth and the functioning of institutions than they did about their political affiliations get recognized for that. And the other group of people who probably deserve some shout outs at the end of this are judges. That's the other place where you actually have to make a case. If you're going to submit a signed claim to a court, there are standards of proof without which the case won't go forward, and we're seeing that now. I despair of a lot of things in American life, but so far, both the election officials in the states and the courts are functioning really, really well here. Now, that could all be tipped upside down if Trump were somehow successful at corrupting the process of choosing and seating electors at the end of all this. I don't think that can happen. I think what we've just seen is there are so many people who are not willing to jump on that kind of live grenade. The people who are in it for their whole lives of public service, not just for November of 2020. I mean, that's the good news, and those people should be affirmed and affirmed and affirmed some more.
I got a break. This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up, we'll check in on a major development related to Stanford-based Purdue Pharma. This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. A federal bankruptcy judge has approved an $8.3 billion settlement for Stanford-based Purdue Pharma. The maker of OxyContin will plead guilty to 3 felony counts of criminal wrongdoing. NPR reports the company is also likely to be reorganized into a public benefit corporation with profits from future opioid sales expected to fund programs aimed at alleviating the addiction crisis. Harriet, I almost missed this story happening yesterday. What are some of the problems with this arrangement from the state perspectives who've sued, including our state, Connecticut?
Yeah, this was a deal that was actually unveiled last month, I think, between the DOJ and Purdue Pharma, but needed the sign-off of the bankruptcy judge. And that is the hearing that happened yesterday. It was a long one. It was like 7.5 hours in court to discuss the settlement before the judge did, in fact, sign off. Connecticut and several other states have, since this deal was unveiled, they've outlined their issues with it, which are really they fall into 2 main buckets. One is the creation of this public benefit corporation. This is how the settlement foresees Purdue Pharma emerging from bankruptcy is as a public benefit corporation, which kind of gets the government into the opioids business. So they would continue to sell OxyContin and put the profits that they make into kind of healing communities. Is the idea is that they would then put the money that they make towards alleviating some of the harm done by the opioid overdose epidemic in lots of communities. And states like Connecticut are saying that really it's too much of a conflict of interest. You shouldn't have the government in the opioids business at all. And how can you still have this company that did so much harm in these communities still kind of entangled in those communities and having a financial relationship? So they strongly object to that construction of how Purdue emerges from bankruptcy. They also object to the Sackler family, the longtime owners of Purdue Pharma, worth, by some estimates, $13 billion as a family, coming off with a penalty of $225 million. That's what's in this settlement with the DOJ, is the Sacklers pay $225 million, which, kind of is the proverbial change down the back of the couch cushions for them. And they say it simply isn't enough.
Colin, what do you think about this settlement?
I think even $8 billion is changed down the back of the couch cushions. And that sounds kind of crazy because $8 billion sounds like a big number. But the history of criminal and civil financial penalties, fines, in this country in recent years is kind of a joke. I mean, it's a way of saying, look, if you want to steal big, be a white-collar criminal. You'll never go to prison. We never send anybody to prison. And you will have fines that really represent a cost of doing business. I think of 2013 when J.P. Morgan Chase was fined, I think, $10 billion, bigger than that with settlements and fees, closer to $20 billion. And, I mean, that bank is doing just fine today. It's a very, very, it didn't get taken down in any significant way. They have the same CEO they had at the time of all that, too. Nobody really got punished. It's important to remember some of these fines can be deducted from corporate taxes. Other parts of the fines can be financed over long terms, stretching out into the misty future. Almost any big player is willing to take billion-dollar fines as a cost of doing business. And ultimately, nothing about this settlement would say to the next malfeasor, oh, don't do it, you'll get in too much trouble.
Harriet, I just wanted to point out that the Purdue executives did plead guilty to illegal marketing of their drugs back in 2007, and then they just went on deceiving doctors and patients. Is there any concern that they may do this again?
I mean, hard to see. I mean, I think with the change of structure in this particular company, maybe that's a little different. But I think there is also concern too that the Sacklers themselves will not face any criminal charges because, there were serious allegations against the board members, 3 of the Sackler family, who were supposed to have pressured executives to sort of pump up sales and keep keep the kind of legitimate market for the drug going when it was kind of dwindling. There are very serious allegations against the Sacklers themselves that they had their hand in this, and yet this settlement doesn't contain any criminal charges for individuals.
Can I quickly say another thing that gets overlooked here is when these kinds of things go on, it's an opportunity to pump up for the company to pump up its market valuation. They make out like bandits in the market because, nobody knows what's waiting over the horizon. Meanwhile, the Sacklers transferred, I think, close to $10 billion out of the company during that time. So maybe they knew what was coming. But, you forget about the stock pricing here, the way in which running a dirty company very effectively and very profitably boosts the market valuation.
And we're almost out of time, but go ahead, Bill, real quick.
Just really quickly, and that is that all those things are true, and the fines are even tax deductible, and the federal government is, and under normal operation of bankruptcy law, just another creditor. So who knows what they're ever going to actually pay. But the point here about personal accountability, we went through this with the Wall Street meltdown, and not a single criminal financier was ever prosecuted for the worst global meltdown in history. In our state's history, with John Rowland, ran the ship of state into the ground. He'd had previous brush-ups with the Ethics Commission and never been forced even to admit wrong when paying nominal fines. If you're in the drug business at a local level, if you're just some sad street hustler peddling dope under a street lamp somewhere in Hartford, you go right to jail. You're right out of the system. And these cartel criminals operating under the color of law, who've done, to say the least, far more. They walk free every time, and so it's just for everyone thinking about criminal justice reform and prison reform and a lot of other issues, we have to look at the extraordinary disparity between what happens to the rich and what happens to the poor.
We've got like 2 minutes, so lightning round here of feats and grievances. Harriet.
I think I should probably give a shout out to Josh Jabal, who made the most of quarantine by getting an 8 out of 10 on his room rater on Twitter.
Colin McEnroe.
Grievance, I'll build on what Bill just mentioned. John Rowland reappeared on WTIC last week. He and his Confederate Will Marotti conducted an appalling conversation about how COVID restrictions were part of the liberal government's attempt to make us more dependent on government and interfere with the free exercise of religion. It's all hooey and dangerous hooey.
And Bill Curry, you get the last word. 1 minute.
Wow, shameful. So my local registrar, Barbara Brenneman, and the Democratic side, we have just a whole set of people. I want to just shout out to all of them again for the job they've done, sometimes under death threats, under enormous partisan pressure, such as I've never seen in this country before, to attempt to warp the process. And they've done very well. And instead of a grievance, I'm going to throw in those judges. There were a lot of Republican judges who made the right calls here. I fear that our judiciary has been politicized and made ideological and corrupt beyond recognition at the federal level, and that's been a concern of mine. For the judges who came through and showed me to be at least a little bit wrong here, I'm grateful to you. For the generals who remembered their oath to the Constitution and not the commander in chief, I'm grateful to them. I hate to find us like any other developing country in precarious straits, depending on our generals for our democracy.
The hook's coming out, Bill. Bill Curry, thank you. Harriet Jones and Colin McEnroe. Today's show produced by Matt Dwyer. Thanks to Kat Pastor. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Back next week.